Hi, welcome to my channel where we provide an alternative view to the common narrative. Today I'm going to talk about a paper that was published in 1994 by a Dr. Barry Posen, and apparently he's a Ford International Professor of Political Science. And he basically developed, or he considered, three strategies for the defense of Ukraine. Now, I believe it is fairly important to understand how the military conflict in Ukraine is progressing, and to fully understand or grasp the military war of action in this conflict. So it's important for me, and I will probably refer to this video many times in the future. So I believe it's fairly important that you watch and continue watching this video. Hi, welcome back to the channel, where I'm going to discuss the military, or a paper that was published by Dr. Barry Posen, who developed some defensive strategies for Ukraine. Now, it was published on November the 11th, 1994. That's a very long time ago. And naturally, a lot of things have changed. Basically, there are a few items that I believe that are still valid in order to grasp and understand what is happening in Ukraine. One of the biggest problems I personally have is that we had the original breakaway from the Donbas regions, and then we had the annexation of Crimea. Then 8 years later, we had the declaration of independence of these Donbas republics, the acknowledgement by Russia as in separate countries, and the subsequent SMO in order to protect the two oblasts or new republics in the eastern part of Ukraine. In this operation, basically, Russia troops moved from the south, from Crimea, up to Kherson area and Zaporizhzhia with very little resistance. Then they entered north in the Kharkiv region, and then they had a long column of military equipment that basically was on its way to Kiev, and there was some military action just outside Kiev. And after there were some negotiations thereafter, and it seems to me that the Ukrainians were ready to basically talk peace and come to some form of agreement, but that was sabotaged by Johnson and Americans, and then Zelensky refused to negotiate any further. The Russians have withdrawn from Kiev. They have also withdrawn from the north of Kharkiv region, Oblast. And basically they have stabilized the front on the Lugansk and Donetsk republics, as well as in the Kherson area and Zaporizhzhia. And they have called up a number of reserves, to be precise, about 300,000 men, plus about 50 to 70,000 volunteers. And the battle lines have now been stabilized for a couple of months, 3-4 months already. And nothing is basically happening except in the area of Bakhmut, which is mostly fought by the Wagner group, with the support naturally of the Russians. And I have a problem understanding that why are the Russians not advancing? Why are the Russians fighting a war of attrition, so-called attrition? And from a military point of view, I can't understand it. And then when I read this paper, then I can understand a lot more, and I hope you can understand it as well. Now, I'm not going to read the paper. It's fairly long. Hopefully I'll still have the link for the paper, and I will leave it then in the description, and then you can read it for yourself if you are interested. But the basic premises is that he already acknowledges that Russia is 3 times bigger than Ukraine. And it is impossible. The economy is bigger, the manpower is bigger, everything is bigger. The technology is better, or supposed to be better. And there is no way, basically, that Ukraine can win this war. So that was already recognized at that stage in 1994. But let's start from the beginning. Since January 1992, the Americans have already been involved in Ukraine in terms of defense agreements, cooperation, and trying to help the Ukraine. At this stage also, they tried to assist them. And at the end of the day, there was the signature of the Partnership for Peace, which is actually a prelude or a waiting room for NATO. And in the same sense, Poland, Romania, Hungary, Slovakia were already also part of this Partnership for Peace. So basically, they were also sitting already in the waiting room for NATO, and it was just a matter of time. So whatever promises America made to Gorbachev with the breakup of the Soviet Union, that is all a farce. Because at that stage, America and NATO already considered the incorporation of or expansion of NATO to the east. And that is clear with the Partnership of Peace. But in any case, coming back to the Ukraine was actually the second, it's the second largest country that became independent from the old Soviet Union. Russia naturally became the first. And from the side of Ukraine, and Ukraine at that stage was a fairly well industrialized country, had lots of potential. It was considered as a middle power country, middle power status country, if you want to call it like that. The Americans at that stage, well, during the Soviet era, a lot of atomic weapons were stored in Ukraine, and the Americans were not happy with that, and they advocated and pushed the Ukrainians to return them, the atomic weapons, nuclear weapons to Russia, which then Ukraine did under a certain agreement. And they returned a lot of the nuclear weapons to Russia, and the ones that they didn't do, they destroyed, and the silos they destroyed, etc., etc. And then Ukraine became part of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Now, and for that, then basically Ukraine had no nuclear weapons, so it had to provide a conventional means of defense and defending itself against any adversary. And Russia was seen at that stage as the biggest adversary and possible attacker, if you want to call it like that. And there's a reason actually for that, is that many Russians believe that Ukraine was always part of Russia, and that they lived a lot of Russian people. And basically it was an unfortunate event that Ukraine became basically an independent country. And as we know, a huge part of the eastern part of Ukraine is inhabited by Russian families and Russian itself. And it should have been part of the old Russia, but it was never done. And you can go into the history and so on, but that's not what I'm going to go into now. Effectively, the numbers that are mentioned in this report are way over. I mean, he states that Ukraine at that stage had 52 million people. We now have the numbers of 14 million people in Ukraine, so that differs. Ukraine was a huge manufacturer, had huge military manufacturing capabilities from the Soviet Union. It also had huge stockpiles of Russian equipment and tanks, and because it was always seen as part of Russia and part of the front line during the Cold War. So a lot of the equipment was stored there. With the breakup of the Soviet Union, The Russians are more or less inherited about 50% of the armament or the military from the Soviet Union, and Ukraine about 15%. Now that's a fair amount because the Soviet Union believed in numbers. They produced huge amount of tanks and aircrafts and artillery pieces and so on. Much, much more than the West or America ever produced. And that is why they had so many weapons and so on. So basically, Ukraine had the industry. I've read another paper where they talked about the military mineral wealth of Ukraine, and it's significant. They have coal, hard coal, soft coal. They have tungsten. They have uranium. They have a little bit of oil and gas, but most of the gas they have to import from Russia. About 90% of their oil and about 70% of their gas from Russia. But the problem is that all this wealth is basically on the eastern side, meaning Donbass area, the pro-Russian side. And if the Russians invaded, they would have invaded from that side. And those would be the first areas that Russia would capture. And naturally, with all that mines and all the industries, heavy industries, remember the steel factory at Mariupol, one of the biggest in Europe. In any case, so a lot of the economy would be occupied by Russian forces. So therefore, they could mount a defensive position, but they never could win. And if Russia was determined enough, they could overrun and then basically conquer Ukraine. So the only way that Ukraine can defend, and this is the core principle, is that they have to delay the Russian forces in order for them to get to start diplomatic negotiations with the West and with America in order for them to support their defense. Now, if you look back at the, what do you call it, Partnership for Peace and so on, basically it is a form of relationship, defense relationship between two countries. And it was done with America and Ukraine, but it doesn't require America to come to the defense of Ukraine, like Article 5 of the NATO alliance. So Ukraine couldn't depend on American that they got involved in the war. But because of the Partnership for Peace agreement, if America didn't help Ukraine, then that would have been a huge political problem for them. And they would lose a lot of faith, if you want to call it, and credibility. They had a similar agreement with the EU countries. So if the EU didn't help Ukraine, then that would also be a huge political problem for the EU. And that's basically why we see the EU and America supporting Ukraine. And that is why Zelensky is shouting and crying and begging and demanding actually for weapons and support, because that is what the Partnership for Peace basically promised. Yes, there is politics have changed a little bit, position have changed a little bit. There was Boris Johnson that scuttled the negotiations, probably promised Zelensky something, and that made him basically demanding the weapons and so on from the West. So I can understand what was happening, but one has to, this Partnership for Peace is a very important agreement that basically requires America and Europe to support, to an extent, Ukraine in the battle against Russia. One should never forget it. That is not part of the common narrative. So one should keep that in mind. In any case, coming back to the military strategy, he developed basically three types of defensive strategies. The core principle basically is based on his numbers, which are a lot less now than it was that stage, that Russia could more or less mobilize 100 divisions, and I believe Ukraine about like 50 divisions, Soviet era type of divisions. The Russians could mobilize more or less 1.5 million people, soldiers, and Ukraine about more like 450,000. And that is the army that they could have mobilized. And now, how do you distribute it together with the weapons that were left over from the Soviet era? Now, you must remember those weapons that were left are now available to Ukrainians are a lot less than they initially had. Why? Because it's 3 years later on. Some of them have been stripped. Some of them need maintenance. Some of them have been sold. And, when arms smuggling was big, Ukraine was one of the big suppliers of old Soviet type of weapons to the underground market. And why? Because Ukraine was corrupt. And that's actually a very sad thing. If you look at the Soviet Union, when it collapsed, collapsed totally. Americans came in, or Europe, and they provide advice that was totally destructive to the Soviet Union. And effectively, they strip-mined the assets of Russia and all the other countries. And basically, the oligarch class that's developed, buying cheap government assets on the penny, etc., and mafias and the crime elements basically started developed. And yes, all these countries were basically in a big downturn. And although in Ukraine, it was a very, very industrial country, it was very rich in that terms as well. It was going well, but with the fall of the Soviet Union, basically the whole economy was destroyed, just like in Russia. The good thing in Russia, they had something like Putin, who could stop the decline of Russia and stop the stripping by the oligarchs and Americans. Unfortunately, Ukraine didn't have it. They continued with their corrupt business, and Ukraine became poorer and poorer and poorer. That is now one of the poorest countries in Europe, that we all know. So a lot of the capability that this person actually was depending on for the defense of Ukraine is not available anymore. I specifically know that Ukraine sold all their T-80 tanks. They have none. But in any case, and the aircrafts are a lot less and so on, and so forth, according to Wikipedia. But one has to always question numbers that are published. Nothing is fairly always accurately. One has to look at the source and see if it's really correct. But I'm deviating again. At the end of the day, the Ukrainian military and the Russian military were well integrated. The officers and the NCOs of both militaries studied together. They had the same doctrines. They have the same capability. So effectively, they are equal competitors, opposing forces. The only difference between the Ukrainian forces and the Russian forces are their military equipment. And that makes a big difference. Now, unfortunately, this man, Dr. Posen, approached the whole principle not from a technical point of view, not from a high-tech point of view, but more something like very similar to the Second World War, and how the Germans progressed over Ukraine and how the Russians drove back the German forces back over Ukraine. And basically, he talks about huge requirement for huge infantry divisions, then mechanized and mobile units, and then a little bit about aviation. But the core principle was that the forces would mostly be infantry with shoulder-launched anti-tank weapons, and he actually mentioned a couple of weapons that destroys tanks. Single tube missiles, in any case, or something like that. But in mines for tank warfare. So a huge number of infantry would have shoulder-launched weapons, similar to what the Germans did, in order to stop the Russian tank and armored attacks. And then he would suggest some mobile divisions, mechanized, that they can be very mobile attacks and then move around and basically attack on flanks, lay ambushes, protect and assist, stay in a reserve, and then assist the infantry once the armor attack of the Russians would start and stuff like that, and so on and so on and so forth. That is basically his core principle and core approach. Also, he assumed that he didn't know about the advances in Russian air defense systems. He knew about the artillery and so on, because most of the artillery is still old weapons. He didn't know about all electronic warfare. Now they knew about UIVs on both sides and intelligence capabilities. But he said that one of the most precious things that the Americans could provide is intelligence, satellite intelligence, and force movements and stuff like that. While the Russians have similar capabilities, I'm not totally sure how competitive they are or if they're on the same level. I know the Americans have extensive satellite capability. I'm not sure about the Russians, but the Russians again has a lot of electronic warfare, counter-electronic warfare type of equipment. So I'm not a total expert on that, but that's beside the point. So we can look at what he was proposing. Now the border between Russia and Ukraine is about 1,600 kilometers. And given the amount of manpower, according to Dr. Posen, and he proposed about 50 divisions of Ukrainians, they cannot basically defend the whole 1,600 kilometers. And if you look at how, remember the border is like where Donetsk is now, and you can see it forms like a bulge. And basically the Russians can attack from the south, the east, or the north. So if the Ukrainians have decided to protect the border, then any breakthrough, say from any directions, will cause the encirclement of any Ukrainian forces and cutting them off from supplies and all the drama that goes basically with it. So it's a very, very bad decision, according to him, the first strategy, to do the forward defense position. The 1,600 kilometer borderline defense. That will not work, and that will be a result into a disaster. And that won't basically happen. Or it won't be good. And apart from that, if you look at the distribution of the population, you will find that about 72% of the population is pro-Ukrainian and 22% of them are Russians. And the Russians are all living on the eastern side in the Donbass area and as well in Odessa. So what basically can happen is that if they defend the border line, if you want the border, forward defense position, they will might find themselves in an environment where the population don't support them, and then they can have necessary problems that goes with it. So the second strategy would be to straighten the line, and if they straighten the line, then they will have a line to defend of about 1,000 kilometers, which is much more viable. Now the question is, where is the second line, the straight line? And if you look at it, that is the line that they are now currently fighting on. That is the Donbass war line, the conflict that we are experiencing now. So this is the second defensive line, and that is much easier to predict. But again, it's a question of they will sacrifice the two eastern part of Syria in order to be able to defend the shorter front line, the 1,000 kilometers. And then they hope that they will create the second strategy will create some mobile divisions, armored divisions, and then basically what these divisions will do would basically do ambushes, select points of low defensive, weak points of the Russians. They will do sporadic type of penetration one in order to inflict as much damage on the Russian forces. And thereby slowly try to raise the cost. Actually, I forgot something to say initially. Because he acknowledges that Ukraine can never win a war against Russia, because Russia is like Goliath against David against Goliath. So you can't just win a war. You know it's lost. But what you can do is you can make the cost of the fight as high as possible. So if Russia attacks Ukraine, then the cost in terms of lives, material, political view, everything is so high that it's not worth the while of Russia to attack Ukraine. And that is what the whole strategy is also based on. Make the cost as high as possible. And then what that basically means is now, if you have the second strategy, then the mobile forces support the infantry that are supposed to protect against an armored attack, and then do their separate mobile attack based on the intelligence that the Americans provide. And then they will raise the cost for the Russian army. And Russia will decide, no, they're not going to advance or maybe withdraw. And if enough Russian soldiers are killed and so on, then basically the Ukrainian force can move forward. And then they gain the Donbass as the Russian forces, while they recover the country that they lost in order to recover, drive them back. But the problem here is that there is no guarantee that the Ukrainian mobile defense is going to be superior to the Russian versions. The Russian version can just do as well. They have the same type of officers, they have the same type of training, they have the same type of equipment, more or less. They have the same doctrines. So it's two basically equal adversaries challenging each other, and there's no guarantee that it will go one way or the other way. So that's, again, one of the weak points of this defense. And if you look at today, and what he also stresses is that if Russia performs a limited strategy, special military operation, a limited, which only has certain limited objective. And remember, the SMO says protection of the Donbass, Crimea, destruction of the Azov, of denazification, and destruction of the Ukraine army. Those are limited. So technically, Russia is totally happy to sit on the front lines where it is now. And now Ukraine has to attack the Russians, because the Russians are not advancing. So you cannot lay an ambush. You cannot destroy the forces. You have to attack now the Russians. And that is precisely what is happening. And he also states, Dr. Posen, specifically states that one of the weak points of the strategies is that if Russia makes a limited incursion, a limited war, then Ukraine has to attack the Russian lines because it has to recover the Donbass. And that is what's happening. And then Russia is slowly destroying the Ukrainian forces. And that is why we have the situation as it is now. And what Russia is waiting, he's waiting for enough destruction of the Ukrainian war and weakening of the Ukrainian military, so that when he starts his big operation, in order to move forward, there is very little resistance left in terms of armor and military personnel. So there is very little of it. They call it a breakthrough. And then he can basically progress over the rest of Ukraine until the Dnieper River. Because one of the problems of Ukraine is it has no natural defensive positions. You know, eastern and middle sides, it's all small forests and open steppe land. They are with a little bit of rivers. They are not big hills or mountains and stuff like that, or big forests or whatever. But on the western side of Ukraine, they have more broadleaf forests, and then they have a marsh, Petro marsh between Belarus and Ukraine that provides some natural type of barriers or fortification, as they call it. So if the Russians break through the lines now, then they can progress, and there's nothing stopping there, and there are no defense positions that the Ukrainians can basically establish. They have to go and retreat right till after the Dnieper River. And that is precisely what also in the Second World War happens. The Germans had to retreat to that river. But again, it's an assumption based on tank warfare and normal aviation, and ignoring all the advances in technology, long-distance missiles, precision missiles, aviation, air defense systems, counter-battery, electoral war. It ignores all that stuff because it wasn't available that prominent at that stage. So that strategy is more encompassed on the Second World War. And then we have the third type of defensive strategy. And this is what we basically going to think it's what's probably going to happen. The Ukrainians will basically establish again mobile defenses of mobile divisions, armored divisions that will, and a number of infantry divisions in order to not stop the Russian advance, but delay the Russian advance. Buy time, sacrifice the eastern part, the Donbass, sacrifice land in order to buy time. Try to inflict casualties in the Russians on a hit-and-run type of there's ambushes, flanking maneuvers, whatever you want to call it. And for that period, then defenses are set up in the West, and diplomatic issues are initiated, and the support of the Western nations are obtained. And basically then, because Ukraine needs a resupply, it needs ammunition, it needs to replace the weapons that it lost, it needs a lot of things, fuel, money for the economy, and so on, which is the West is giving. But it needs time to get this stuff going. In a modern time, like in this one, it didn't take much time because the West was already ready with their supply lines and support and agreements and political maneuvering and whatever you want to say, and the sanctions. So they didn't have much wind. That's why we haven't progressed there. But in any case, so it's basically a stalling or delaying tactic by mobile units and some infantry for the Ukrainians to build up proper defenses behind the Dnieper River on the west side. But he also acknowledged that Dnieper River is a big obstacle, but it's not. It's a strategic defensive line. But it will also be lost if the Russians are determined. But in order to cross the river and do it, what is it again? The cost factor. Make it expensive for the Russians to advance. But in that stage, they will also have probably conquered Odessa, Mykolaiv, Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, and Kharkiv Oblast, and in the middle of what I don't know what other oblasts are in the middle and so on. But they will conquer everything and mop up all that. But the further Russia goes to the east, to the west, the more the population will turn pro-Ukrainian. And that creates problems of themselves, like partisan war and sabotage and so on. And in order to counter that, Russia must commit more forces. Becomes more expensive. Sabotage and so on are destructive and are more focused not on the military aspects, but more focused on the population and change the mood of the population. And then we have propaganda and all the other stuff that starts to play a role. Okay, but basically the third offensive one is they stop at the Dnieper and they try to defend it as best as possible. Again, having mostly infantry in the reserve, their tanks and the armor to support the breakthrough or prevent the breakthrough of tank armored vehicles. And they also acknowledge that in a duel, artillery duel, Ukrainian won't be able to win it because of amount, the numerical superiority, etc., etc. He does talk a little bit about aviation, and again, he assumes that Ukraine will not achieve air superiority because Russians are more advanced and have more numbers and so on, and air defense systems. But Russia will also not have a free hand. But the little bit that aviation is responsible for is the protection of the western area and basically the support of infantry and mobile in terms of attack on armor and bombing of artillery pieces and so on, or even suppressing artillery firing and their fire plans and stuff like that. So it's the effect or the accuracy of the aviation attacks is not important as the disruptive effect that it might bring. But according to the numbers, well, Ukraine is not supposed to have any aviation anymore, but they still do, because the Russian defense every second day still shoots down a MiG or whatever issue. But that's a debatable point. One of the other things that he quite mentioned, which was interesting, in order to put up the defense and to gain the support of the Western world, he has to show Ukraine that he has the support of the people and that a 1 million man army is willing to die and sacrifice themselves for the country. And that's a lot of ask. And as we know, or as I've told you, 22% of the population is Russian. So the Russians will not sacrifice themselves in a war against Russia. So they have to convince his population to become pro-Ukrainian and are willing, from a patriotic and a nationalistic view, to sacrifice themselves for the protection of the fatherland. And if you think about back for the last 8, 9, 10 years, well, Ukraine has become Nazified. Nazified is not my name. This is the pro-Russians' name. I call them nationalists. They are proud to be Ukrainians. That's nationalism. They are not Germans. They are nationalists. They are Ukrainians. That brings with himself a certain form of patriotism and willing to sacrifice yourself. And with the ban of the Russian language and the Russian culture and so on, in the last of time, there was a change in the culture of the Ukrainians. They have become more Ukrainian, and some of the Russians have even, I wouldn't say defect to the Ukrainian side, but culturally wise, they would have now believe they are more Ukrainian than they are Russian. And that is how they change the attitude. And maybe now what they try to do is to establish a 1 million man army that would be willing to sacrifice themselves for the fatherland, the Ukraine. You can see the propaganda and the actions that has happened in the last 10 years. Well, that is what they try to do. So basically, Ukraine needs to be supported by the West with weapons, etc. Yes, they initially got all the weapons from the old Warsaw Pact countries, but if that's finished now, they're going to need a Western type of weapons. And I will talk about that in a different video. But this is quite important. And the point here is while we might be still stuck on the defensive strategy number 2, where they try to defend the current line of contact, is because of the technology has changed, because Russia can basically bomb any place, anywhere in Ukraine with their long-distance precision missiles. So nothing is basically protected. So withdrawing to a safe area in the rear doesn't guarantee you safety. It might also be that the fanatics in Ukrainian military have such a big, they might consider withdrawing from any area and giving it to the Russians, like Crimea or the Donbass, is against their principles, and they would consider that as treacherous. And if Zelensky does it, then he's a traitor, basically sacrifice land for the safety of their troops. It's like what Russia did with Kherson, the strategic withdrawal, sacrificing territory for the safety of the troop and set up a new defensive line. Well, some of the Ukrainian commanders might think that would be treacherous. That's why they're staying, and that's why they're fighting in Ukraine. Another reason why they are fighting, probably, or estimated, is Bakhmut. Not withdrawing from Bakhmut due to its treacherous. Again, yeah. They might think that withdrawing from Ukraine, from Bakhmut, will open up a spearhead for the Russian forces to penetrate. It's like bursting open, and then they go through with their big offensive. And that would be the collapse of the front. So maybe that is the reason why they are fighting and sacrificing so many men and equipment in Bakhmut. Then there was also another thing. We're all speculating at this because nobody really knows about what is going to happen and what's really happening. I'm amazed it took so long to conquer Bakhmut. Because Bakhmut is the strategic thing for the Ukrainians, because it has railways that connect and stations and roads that connect. But if you look at the maps and you look at the distance, they're all within artillery range. So they can destroy the railway lines, the connections, the stations. What? That's not assets. That's not a strategic asset. If the enemy can destroy it, it can destroy the roads. Yeah, like they destroy airports, military airports, landing strips. Destroy the road, and that's it. Bridges, access bridges, railway bridges on towards Bakhmut. Could have destroyed it a long time ago if they wanted it. So I'm not always concerned about the strategic importance of certain things, especially roads and the railways, because you can destroy it, and you can make it inoperable, non-functioning. But there's also, apparently, somebody observed that there are very few tanks at this stage being reported destroyed in the daily military briefings. And if you look at the strategy that he proposes, there's infantry, which are currently being employed by the Ukrainian forces. And maybe they have moved back all the artillery tanks, not the artillery, the tanks and APCs and fighting vehicles to the rear. That should the infantry collapse, then they have reserves, the armored reserves, in order to counter the envisioned penetration of the Russian army during that break. It might also be a possibility. So we're not totally sure what's happening. And unfortunately, everything is sort of like speculations. But this report gave me a good idea from how the current war is basically developing. We had the Donbass, so with a forward defense was never an option. Then we had the secondary defense, which is the mobile defense, which is currently happening, with some variation. Just remember, the mobile defensive one was the penetration of weakly pointed or weakly defended Russian defended areas in Izium and Liman. That was a typical mobile attack. And if you look at the attacks on the Kherson area, the Ukrainians did advance. They advanced 2, 3, 4 kilometers and drove the Russians back until the Russians finally decided to have the tactical withdrawal from the Kherson area. But they were retreating. And that's why I always say Kherson was a military strategic failure. So the next phase, in my opinion, based on the summaries, based on the terrain that he describes, based on what happened in the Second World War, based on the only things that really left is, if the breakthrough happens, then the Ukrainian forces have to retreat. The natural next defensive line is the Dnieper River. Russians will move forward. They will occupy everything east of the Dnieper River, according to him, which I totally agree with. That is the next defensive line. And then we will probably stagnate again. And then we will see what will happen. And then anything goes, because we can have diplomatic settlements, peace agreements, or we can have an escalation of the war where NATO enters western Ukraine, or the Russians can decide, in the meantime, we're going to hold, again, a war of attrition, missiles, artillery, destroy the Ukrainian army on the west side bank, and there we go, and go, just like now. So in any case, I think that's like I said, a lot have changed, but the core principle still applies. And it sort of makes me understand what is happening now and what the future will bring. It's all a question of cost versus benefit. How much is Russia prepared to sacrifice? How far is it willing to go? And in my opinion, it's going to go all the way. They need to fulfill their objectives. Demilitarization and denazification. And the full liberation of the 4 provinces. Non-negotiable. And even of offer of peace talks, that would be the minimum settlement. But I believe there will be no peace agreements. I will see the next phase will basically start at the Dnieper River. Well, I hope it was for you interesting enough and you understand it. And hopefully you can look at the conflict with a bit of different eyes. I found it the hell of it. I could have read it, you would have taken 3 hours. But I just sort of decided I'll sum it rather up. So, that's for today. If you haven't subscribed, subscribe. Tell your friends, let them subscribe. Press the notification button. Press the like button. Leave a comment, etc., etc., etc. So until next time, cheers.